The only way, at least as far as I know, that we can learn to tolerate uncomfortable emotion is to stare right at it. When you're a kid and you're in bed and, the monster under the bed, until you look under the bed, the monster is theoretically always there. You have to get out of bed and look under there and say, what's scaring me here? It probably turns out there is a lot less to fear than you think, and you have a lot more courage than you think you do.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Unapologaytic podcast. My name is Pierre. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Jason Durant, the author of Boy from the North Country. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm about halfway through, but I felt a lot of grief at times by reading it. And I think, oh my God, I can really recognize myself. I've been through something very, very similar. Obviously, I'm from a really small island in the Caribbean, which is not, as far as climate is concerned, that's not the cold of the North Country, but it's still a really small community. And I think in my experience as well, the relationship to masculinity and to fitting in at school, in a group, I felt that too.
The work that I do is primarily with gay men. And there's almost an automatic shorthand that happens in our communication because of the thing that you're talking about precisely. I have yet to meet a client who comes in and has not sensed that feeling of alienation in their life. Some, even in New York City. So, I think there's just a natural empathic connection that I have with my patients that really has something to do with identification as a gay man and growing up with that experience. It's the reason that people come, really. Most of the people who reach out to me say, I heard that you're a gay therapist and I'm looking for a gay therapist. So they want that sense of understanding about what that experience of being a fish out of water is all about.
Do you think there is a common thread among all the gay men who come to see you?
Aside from just the sexuality piece, we still live in a world, and it obviously varies country by country, but we live in a world that has a pejorative attitude about gay people. Even in places like New York City, where there's a high degree of tolerance, there's still an othering experience of gay people. And it comes with a lot of both sides. There's a lot of expectations for who we are from people who aren't gay. And on our side, there's a lot of unconscious identification with who we're supposed to be. And our community has its own, let's just say, issues with body acceptance and other things. And so I think anytime that you have people living in a society where they're not fully embraced as normative, you're going to find people who are connected sort of unconsciously through that experience. So I think that there is, yeah.
When I was growing up, it was easier to report racism than homophobia, let alone transphobia. At the time, that wasn't even thought about.
We weren't there yet. Just to comment on your point again, I think another piece that I see, at least in my practice, is that shame is another one of these connective tissues that kind of run between us. Most of us, at least men, so I'm 50, so at least men maybe 30 and up, things do seem to have changed somewhat for the younger generation. You spend most of your childhood trying to hide from being found out. So what you said about how difficult it is to report homophobia makes total sense because it implicates you. And the range of consequence for being outed, where I grew up in the 1980s, ranged from social ostracization, if I can get that word out, all the way to potential violence. There was a real fear that I could be in physical harm. So you spend so much of your time trying to not be seen for who you are. I think, you mentioned grief, and I actually talk to patients about this quite a bit. There is a grief for what was missed, because when you're not really able to express who you are, and you're deliberately hiding that, I think there's always like a fantasy of what could have been. And that's loss. That's a feeling of loss. And I think perhaps that's what you were picking up on, but I certainly know that I experienced that as I was coming through my sort of healing process and accepting myself as a gay man, I realized how many maybe missed opportunities there were, or friendships or relationships I didn't pursue or couldn't pursue, or almost like endless numbers of things that never got to happen because I couldn't be myself. And when you start to process that, there's certainly sadness, if not full blown grief, around that loss of humanity.
When you talk about trying to hide, my understanding of that is that's, or at least maybe in my experience, I feel like that's internalized homophobia.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does. We're expected to internalize it. That is, the adults, at least specific to where I was growing up in the time period I grew up there, I think things have changed somewhat, just to give that out. There was a tacit awareness of the fact that there were gay people, but it was expected that they be quiet about it or not make a big fuss about it. And that was a direct, I think, message to you: keep it to yourself and maybe become a priest or find some other way to live your life, but don't expect that you're going to grow into a fully functioning gay person who can express themselves openly, have happy relationships, live fully in society as an equal. You were expected to internalize it. So I think that hiding is really about trying to preserve some sense of dignity, even though it feels counterintuitive, like to hide who you are. But I think it was a way to stay connected to the community and feel some sense of dignity, because at least when I was a kid, there was no dignity in being a gay person, and we didn't have any heroes to look up to, really, not at all.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that, I mean, I'm 47. I remember there was very little representation, especially positive representation of LGBTQ people on TV or anywhere in the media.
When I was very young, it was always like comic. There was like Paul Lynde, who was like the center square on Hollywood Squares, and they were these butts of jokes, was essentially what gay people were. And then when we got into the mid 1980s, right when I was getting into middle school and that sort of thing, the AIDS crisis
Yeah.
hit, and suddenly we weren't the butt of jokes so much as we were like sick people. So all we heard about, even if the media coverage was sympathetic, which it wasn't that sympathetic, but even when it was, it still carried this connotation of being gay was very closely associated with being sick or potentially even infectious, which is worse than being sick. And I remember kids would call each other AIDS case in middle school, which was like, a taunt or a bullying strategy to basically associate you with being gay and that sort of thing. So we didn't really have anybody that we could look up to and say, gay is good. It was more like the 1990s when that started to change.
I wonder if you could talk about how you got out of it, or what I'm trying to say is how you learned to overcome that or get rid of the internalized homophobia.
One of the things I like to say is that we are who we are because of the trauma and not in spite of it, though I don't think we would ask for more pain. Our character forms around it. And one of the things that my personal experience and I hear from my patients is that when you don't fit in, when you're not fully welcome, the Kiwanis Club is not sending you an invitation to join, and you're not invited on the hunting trips and all that kind of stuff, you don't have to stay. And you have a certain permission to basically, when you hit 18, you're free to go in a way, because there's no expectation that you're going to live fully in the community. So for me, I knew very early on that the minute I could, I was moving on. I was not going to stay in that community that didn't really have a place for me anyway. And that was really the beginning of a journey of self-acceptance. Now, took a long time. I mean, there was a lot of pain because when I started to form relationships with men, like romantically, not just sexually, but romantically, I realized that I couldn't really love someone because there was so much of myself that I couldn't access because I had disassociated myself from it. I was pretending I wasn't that person. So for me, the journey was really about trying to get back to a place where I could be fully me and embrace all of the pain and all of the trauma. And, bullying leaves a scar. You carry that trauma with you. So you have to find a way to love that and go back and see yourself in those situations and be okay and not be ashamed of yourself. So tuning into all of those feelings that would get triggered the minute I would get intimate with another man. Again, not sexually, that somehow that was easy enough. It was when the side of me that needed to be emotionally present, that's when I would start hiding again and trying to be close with another person, particularly men, because let's face it, they're most often are tormentors when you're a gay boy. And I think it had everything to do with gender in that case. I would start pulling away or withdrawing or not being fully present in some way. And it was when I started to realize that I wasn't really in my relationships, that there was a whole part of me that I was afraid to bring into the equation because I was protecting it just as I had my whole life. It was only as an adult and only when I was with people who maybe were a little more healthy than me and were actually able to be intimate and present that I realized the contrast, that I was like, oh boy, you got a lot of work to do here because you're not capable of bringing something that you're ashamed of into a relationship until you find a way to allow that shame to dissipate and to learn to be affectionate toward who you are. The journey for me really was in that area of learning to notice. Almost, this is where mindfulness kind of comes in on a moment by moment basis when I was retreating or when I was disassociating and saying, okay, this is a feeling you got to learn to feel. This here's another one. And for a while there, I've been at this a while. I'm very good at not being present. And it by being with particularly my first boyfriend and my current husband, while being with people who were tolerant or loving enough or patient enough to allow me to sort of go through those fits and machinations and try again and try a little harder the next time and get more comfortable, I started to begin to see that the that who I was in totality was okay and that I could bring that person to the relationship. And when I started to do that, it started healing a lot of that pain. It never goes away all the way. I think some of that stuff is structural in your brain because you build who you are around it. So I don't think it's ever gone, but you can develop a way of being present with all of it. And if you need a moment to experience emotion, to take that moment to become less afraid of it so that you're not attaching or disavowing. And when you do that, you can sort of almost like watch these things play out in front of you, notice your feeling, but not grab onto them, but allow them to pass. And that gives you the opportunity to stay in the moment, stay in intimacy, really, and the vulnerability of intimacy. And that, to me, that's kind of how I think about my process of coming to accept myself.
Is it a way to sort of be intimate with ourselves, sort of create space for us to feel whatever emotion we're trying to block, or we've trained ourselves? I've trained myself to block, for example.
And that's a really beautiful question. I think that is the heart of what I'm talking about in the book anyway, is you have to find a way to build that relationship with yourself, to see yourself, all of it, all of the pain, all of the bad stuff as part of who you are, and to find a way, even if it's not quite loving it every time, but to not resist it and to not deny it. That is intimacy. I think that meditation is one way, but it also can be more simple than that. It can be more like when you get home from work and you put on a favorite song and experience yourself fully and all your reactions to it, and allow yourself to just be present alone and enjoy all of your emotional reaction. Even simple moments like that, if you can be honest with what you're feeling and be honest with some of the stuff you've been in denial about, that's when you begin to have that relationship with yourself that is really about a kind of self-intimacy, as you said.
It sounds like, I mean, once again, I can only speak for myself, but it
Yeah.
sounds like this is a journey. And what I'm trying to say is that I've been looking for the magic bit, or, something that instantly will sort me out. But what I mean by it's a journey is that it's a practice, a bit like mindfulness, like meditation and everything. I have to chip at it every single day.
Me too. You know, I detail a story in the introduction of the book about a session with a patient who's having a problem with his partner. And I remember when that session happened, it could have been my own life. And it happens daily sometimes, where a patient will come in. I mean, I'm a gay man in New York City, and so are all of my patients. So the lifestyle factors, there's a lot of overlap there. Um, but I feel a part of what makes it work, I think, is that they can see that I feel what they're feeling. I know what's going on. And it's, again, I say it never really goes away, but it's about a commitment to yourself as valuable enough to stay in that healing process. Because, just if you think about it from the brain perspective, the brain wants to be very well rehearsed and to fall back into pattern. That's just the way. It probably has something to do with survival on the savannah, some kind of evolutionary thing. And I think we kind of have to wake up every day and remind ourselves that we are beautiful enough and lovable enough to recommit to not falling back into that more dissociative pattern of acting out, for example, or avoiding emotion, or all that kind of stuff.
In a way, that's the scary bit, because in the bit you talk about, I remember again, feeling the grief of, when I say grief, is feeling the identification of you. What I remember at the beginning is you say, well, you have to do it yourself. It's a time to do it alone. And I think that's when I felt the most grief, because the way I understood it was, nobody can do it for me. It's my job.
It is your job. It's just as it is all of our job. And I actually think it's not as bad news as it sounds, right? Because there's another story later in the book. I don't know if you got this far, but I, somewhere back there, had a really bad crush on a guy, and he was straight, and so it was doomed from the start. And it sort of took over for a period of 6 or 8 months, where it was like all I could think about it. I got depressed and wasn't going to classes when I was college. And at the same time, it turned out I was forming this other group of friends that I didn't realize that healing was happening underneath all of this sort of surface pain. And I remember very distinctly, I had gone home because I was overwhelmed with what was going on. And then I was home for like a day, and I said to my parents, I can't stay here. Going back is not going to fix this problem. So I went back to the town where I went to college, and I showed up at one of my friends' apartment. They were all there. We were going to a movie that night or something, and they were all very happy to see me. And I remember distinctly feeling like, wait a minute, I have all of these relationships that are relatively healthy with people I like and like me. Something about me was continuing to grow, even though on another level, I felt completely stunted by what was happening. So what I mean is, we know how to do it. It's within us already, but it takes that commitment to the process to bring it to the surface. But I do believe we all have the ability to heal. Humans are naturally developmental in nature. We grow. And I think the same is true for us emotionally. If we pay attention to it and lean into it, we can expedite that process.
I wonder if there are any sort of quick hacks. I can't think of any other words, to share with people who are struggling with internalized homophobia.
The first thing that popped into my head was make good friends, you know, find a community of, I don't want to say enlightened because that sounds a little dramatic, but find a community of people who are loving and supporting and patient and are also committed to growth and self-development. The gay community is a beautiful community. It's my community. I don't mean to be critical here, but and it's no surprise that substance abuse is a problem in our community. And part of that is because of trying to disconnect from all that pain. And there's not a moral judgment here, but when there's too much time in that world, or too much alcohol, or too much partying, and not enough emphasis on that self-development process, it can get sort of catty, and it can get sort of where people aren't as supportive of each other, and the body shaming and all those kinds of things. That's not going to get you closer to where you want to go. So if there's a hack, find loving people who really care about you, who understand what you're feeling and are there to see you make it. That'd be my first tip.
Is journaling helpful?
It's one of the first things I tell every time a new patient comes in on the first day. I journal every day. When you leave the office, write down what you thought was most important, not necessarily what I said, but what you really felt like was going to be the most useful. Because when you do that, you are reminding yourself of these little micro lessons that come up and recommitting to them. And there isn't a switch, like you said. It is every day making little changes, whether they be, everything feedback, right? So what you give out will find its way back to you. How you treat your friends is how they're going to end up treating you. How you perform at work is going to result in how far you go in your job. Like, these are just rules that we don't get to change. So when you are committed every day to making these positive changes that are feeding back in a positive way, you will see that you're getting better. And, part of it is even the daily affirmation of waking up and saying, I deserve to be taken care of today, and I'm going to take that on. I'm going to commit that to myself. Even that little act, you will find that you make decisions that are better for yourself. Because for instance, let's say you're in a toxic relationship, be that platonic or romantic. That negative emotional pattern is going to feed back in your emotional life and make you less healthy. That's just how it works. You have to commit to making the changes. And sometimes you can get a partner who will stay with you and you'll do it together. And other times we have to say, this is not for me. This relationship is making me less healthy. But the wisdom to know when to make that call, I think, happens when you're committed every day to listening to yourself, every day to taking care of yourself. You go, you know what, this friend or this boyfriend or this fuck buddy is not helping me get healthy, and I need to maybe move on from that relationship in order to keep on my trajectory. But it does take that every day recommitting to yourself, and which is really about choosing to see your value, to say, I'm good enough, I deserve this.
How about revisiting the past? Not so much to sort of, rehash it, but this week, actually, I had a really magical experience where I had my first day at school when I was 6 was quite challenging because I felt shame. The teacher made us read out loud, and I made a mistake, and the rest of the pupils laughed at me. The change, instead of rehashing the shame, I sort of, as an adult, I went back and I imagined that I was comforting myself as a child. And instantly I felt a change in my energy, or at least the inner child's energy shifted from shame and all of that to actually being really calm and, sort of, okay, well, I can go on with the day.
Thank you for sharing that.
Do you think that could help other people?
Rehashing my past, I always say, if it's only relevant if it's relevant. So if the shame you felt when you were 6 is still part of your consciousness today, then we have to understand it. And it often is very helpful to go back and say, when do you think all this got started? What are the first few times where shame started to enter into how you felt about yourself? And it can be very healing for people to sort of imagine themselves as the 6-year-old kid and maybe speak to themselves a little differently, or just kind of hold space for that kid who probably didn't get a chance to express himself in that moment. Obviously, you're really healing the person you are today, necessarily the 6-year-old, but I think that there's a lot of, particularly around issues of shame and embarrassment and that kind of stuff, it usually happens in secret. We usually don't get seen for it, particularly around gay issues, right? When, we don't get to go home and tell mom because we risk being found out, right? So sometimes just by going back and talking through the story and leaving room for that emotion to be witnessed with someone else, or even by your own acknowledgement, I do think that there's a lot of healing that can happen. You can get stuck in the past, and some people do, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here.
Let's try not to be stuck in the past. For example, we talked about the pendulum swinging back. So how can we sort of support ourselves as a community or as an individual in those challenging times?
Grappling with that question right now, as you may have read, we had a big election. And the startling thing about it is how many people that I must have known voted for the other guy.
Yeah.
And yet are supposedly, not homophobic and are allies or supporters. And trying to reconcile that interpersonal piece has been a challenge for me, because this is one person's opinion. I find, the coalition you build to elect someone like that involves people who would just as soon see people like us dead or at least invisible, right? So I have a really hard time personally sitting with someone who I know has aligned themselves with people who are very dangerous to people like me. So there's that personal piece that I'm currently trying to sort through in my own mind. But I think as a community, I think courage here, I think not going back into the closet is really at the heart of keeping the train on the track, or whatever, pick your metaphor, in terms of continuing to move forward. I was just after the election, 3 days or so after, I happened to be in Times Square, and this group of kids, they were like, I don't know, 17-year-old boys. Every one of them had a MAGA hat on, like 7 or 8 of them. And they were speaking just walking, aggressively speaking about the election and saying basically screw the liberals and this kind of stuff. And there was a pack of them. And I immediately, this is in New York City, Midtown Manhattan, immediately felt internalized homophobia. It just came right up like a volcano. And I don't live in rural Arkansas, where people are driving around with that kind of thing on pickup trucks with flags and really demonstrating. And regardless of that, it's still in alignment with a group of people who see everything that we're trying to do as needing to be corrected and reversed. So I know that there are people who are probably feeling a temptation to respond to that internalized homophobia that I'm sure they feel when they see the truck passing them on the highway. We can't. We have to stay visible, and we have to, even in rural communities, we have to let people know that, we deserve space. We deserve to be here in this world. Every human has that built-in right to be who they are and to love who they want. And I think giving an inch on that would, and I understand when people may have to for safety and that kind of thing, but I think as a community, I don't think we give an inch.
Because then the temptation is to sort of hide and revert to a childlike behavior or even teenage-like behavior.
Fear is a powerful motivator, and really that's my biggest concern isn't so much about adult gay men, though I do have concern for that. It's the kids. who, Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill, that's going back to when I was a kid, when there was no access to resources or visibility. I worry about, bringing up another generation of people filled with shame over the simplest thing in the world, which is who they truly are. That is very unfortunate.
I'd like to move on to a more positive note. What's your idea of authentic pride?
I think we have to, I almost said the word earn it, but I don't quite mean it as earn it. I think we kind of achieve it. You know, it's really hard to feel good about yourself when you're mistreating yourself. And again, I understand why people want to disassociate because there's a lot of pain and trauma. But when you're gesturing to yourself that it's okay to take second fiddle, then you're not going to feel very good about yourself. So I think you start with the principle of I deserve this, but then you prove it to yourself. And I think you prove it to yourself by being kind to yourself, by practicing good self-care, by even things like working hard at your job or learning a skill or something that you get good at. I think pride becomes more and more authentic as through everyday kind of the gestures that we make toward ourselves. It's just really hard. It's a lot easier to authentically feel it when every day you say, I'm doing these things that are good for me because I deserve it. A lot easier to feel good about yourself.
That reminds me of what you write about when you were growing up on the farm. I found it really touching how you said that when you noticed that there were things that you were really good at, even if that you didn't fit the traditional masculine mold, so to speak, but there were still things that the impression I'm getting is that it wasn't really about what other people thought, but it was how you saw yourself. And you were like, well, these are things I know I can do. I'm really good at. And that reminds me of the authentic pride. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, thanks for making that connection. You made the connection that I hadn't quite made in my own mind, but I still do. I still think about being 10, 12, 14 years old and not feeling particularly valued at school. I didn't play hockey. Like there was, I didn't have the sort of traditional things that would get you recognized. But I was good around the farm, There was a lot of things I could do independently, even in a precocious way. Maybe like at 10 years old, I was driving tractors and baling hay and milking cows and all this kind of stuff that, you feel good when you know how to do something. And I think that's exactly the same point I was trying to make a few minutes ago about, authentic pride comes when we can believe more than just that fundamental belief that all humans are equal, which I think is still true. The more you see yourself reflecting love for yourself, and that's reflected in learning how to do things as just one example, I think that pride feels a lot more authentic.
Isn't there a saying that goes like, you build self-esteem by doing estimable things? Is that?
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's something we say in recovery, I think. Oh, that's where I heard it.
I think we mentioned earlier that the substance use issue in the gay community, it's not a surprise that would come out of the recovery movement, because it is, if you're hungover every day or struggling with substance use of any kind, it's really hard to feel self-esteem because it just feels always out of reach. And if you're in a cycle of addiction, even worse, and you can't, it's really hard to feel good about yourself.
I like to think that we're not in the 80s anymore. What I mean by that, there are a lot more resources available. I mean, a lot more positive resources online, whether it's social media or YouTube. I think it's a bit easier now to block the noise and to sort of focus on something that actually reflects a positive light on the queer community.
Yeah, fortunately, on the representation side, there is a lot more out there for us to see people who are alive. That was a big problem for the longest time because of the AIDS crisis, but not only alive, but thriving and happy and reflecting good relationships and good values and accomplishing things. There is one takeaway from the book that I like to talk about a little bit, and it sounds a little bit dark, but I really mean it in a positive thing. Stop waiting nobody's coming. And I think that we carry this fantasy that a perfect boyfriend or a perfect uh, outfit or a perfect night out, that something else is going to come along and make it all better or make us whole. um, you're the one who can do that, and you can do that every day. You can start today. It really is good news, because the longer you wait, it's just going to extend the pain. The sooner that you start accepting that, okay, it's my life, I've only got one time to live it, far as we know, um, I deserve to be taken care of. And when you start to do that, when you start to take care of yourself, the healing just naturally follows. And it might mean therapy, it might mean yoga, it might mean meditation, maybe you go to church, who knows? But some kind of commitment to yourself to demonstrate that you have value starts with you. And that's just something I think is my main takeaway from the book. So I'd like to leave people with that one.
Thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me of what we were talking about earlier about the what we were saying, that it's our job. And I talked about it as something, I remember using the word lonely, but it doesn't have to be scary. It's just that this is something we have to do for ourselves. It doesn't have to be, the loneliness is nothing to fear.
Well, the loneliness is probably causing fear because it triggers memories of being an isolated kid, particularly as a gay person in a straight world. And make friends with it, because the only way, at least as far as I know, that we can learn to tolerate uncomfortable emotion is to stare right at it. When you're a kid and you're in bed and the monster under the bed, until you look under the bed, the monster is theoretically always there. You have to get out of bed and look under there and say, what's scaring me here? It probably turns out there is a lot less to fear than you think, and you have a lot more courage than you think you do.
So my final question, for now anyway, is Unapologetic's tagline is embrace who you are. Mm-hmm. So what's your idea of embracing who you are?
That's a really great question. I think what I would say to that is it's like, take a warts and all approach to who you are, at least to start with, because what you think is going to be your worst is part of the healing of who you're going to become. At the beginning, I said we are who we are because of all the trauma and not in spite of it. There's no going back. You're never going to go and not have been traumatized by being a gay kid in a rural community in upstate New York. Just talking to myself there, that's not going to happen. And all that secrecy and shame and hiding, when you embrace that as just part of who you are, you now have the ability to help someone else. You now have an understanding of humanity. It makes you a more compassionate person. And I think it also inspires a certain kind of courage. Once you know you can face it and you can confront it, I think it just sort of builds that thing that we're talking about, self-esteem, which is sort of like courage a little bit. So I guess that's what my answer to that would be. Embrace it all, and what you don't need will fall away if you really commit to that self-healing process.
Can I sneak in a final question?
Sure.
But in my experience, again, I can only talk about that. I've experienced some anger. So are there any safe ways to process anger for you? Or can you recommend safe ways to process anger?
Well, I want to
if it shows up in other people.
It shows up everywhere. I think one of the reputations of, I don't know if you've seen Boys in the Band, the reputation of gay men is that there's like this sarcastic or sardonic humor. And I think part of that is actually anger. I think that there's a certain bitterness that comes from that grief that we talked about so much earlier, that feeling of being alienated, a little justified rage here was make space for it, right? So I don't want to throw anger out, but I will say that my kind of working feeling is that anger is typically a mask for a more vulnerable feeling. I think when we're really angry, we're actually probably scared or hurt. So if I were to say how to process anger, I would just sort of ask yourself the question, am I really angry, or did something get triggered in me that's causing me to feel pain or loneliness or isolation or something like that? Because when you start to go under the surface there and you start to deepen that reflective question,
Mm.
suddenly you now have you have more material to work with other than anger, which is it's a very thin material. Anger it's very brittle. You can't do much with it. But if you dig in under the surface, you may find that you can start to think about some of these more complicated feelings that we're talking about. And if I just might add a second point to that, the other thing that I would say about anger is that you can feel it without identifying with it. So you can feel angry without being, I'm angry. And the distinction there is important because the feeling is just a phenomenon. It's going to come, it's going to hit a peak, and then it's going to go down, and it's going to pass on. If you now I'm angry, suddenly you're attaching to it and you're now identified with that. And it's a lot harder to let it go when you're sort of, gripping that
Yeah.
anger. Just watch it. Try not to act out on it. Try to allow yourself to feel it. Ask some questions about what you're really feeling under the surface, but don't identify with it because you're just feeling a feeling and you might not even know yet why you're feeling it.
Well, in my mind, that links back to the mindfulness you mentioned earlier.
Directly.
Yeah, or another thing within recovery is these too shall pass. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So where can people find you?
So you can find my website at drjasondurant.com. But if you're interested in, and also on Instagram, it's Dr. Jason Durant. On Facebook, it's Dr. Jason Durant. So if you can remember that. And if you're interested in buying the book, pretty much all the online booksellers will have it. So you can find it on Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all of those Goodreads, all of them.
And it's an amazing book. I love reading. It's so nice it feels so personal and it's full of wisdom, I find.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Really
much
appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story or your life so authentically. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you for listening, everybody, and watching. And please share it with people you think need it. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye, Jason. Oh, bye, doctor. Sorry.